straight to Court Square.
And that's right.
And that's it.
there.
And then so you come upstairs, go around the corner, it's right there. Let me tell you, they keep, I've been to all those groups already.
Okay, good morning.
But it's a nice.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I had one loud voice and then mumbles. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. Oops. So you guys still want to be lawyers?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
There was no other reason to be in this room. So the main proposition is to get this down, right? Is to approach the entire test with the same methodology that you're going to approach law school. So when you come into law school, you're fluent in how you're going to have to learn. Okay. If it didn't help you on the LSAT, that would be one thing. But it beyond helps you on the LSAT. So we'll certainly go over logical and analytical today. This is our world, and this is the world. If you go into logical reasoning, this is what they're testing. Honest to God, this is what they're testing. If you want to be a lawyer, doesn't it make? Have you met people who are not particularly gifted at drawing conclusions? Or have you met people? Distinguished from an opinion, right? You can have whatever opinion you want. But opinions don't require a process. You with me?
Right.
They don't require any of this. I can have an opinion. I can have a favorite color. I can have a favorite ball team. I can have an opinion on politics. But that doesn't require any evidence. You with me? And what's fundamentally, I don't want to say different, but man, we're all about evidence. We're all about reasoning. So that's what the test is testing, and they don't give you time purposely, right? So that when you don't have time, and again, do you think as an attorney you're going to run into multiple instances where you feel you don't have enough time? Talk to me.
Yes.
So if you performed poorly when time pressure was applied, it might be problematic for this profession. Might not be. There are some areas of law where it's unlikely you're going to succeed. So this has to become sort of rapid fire, meaning you do it naturally. It has to be either required or God-given, but you have to reason this way. And it's so not complicated. It's just so not complicated. Can you set aside whatever views you have? Can you set that aside?
Yes.
And can you read a law as it's written? Can you read a statute as it's written? Talk to me.
Yes.
Even if it's written in a way that you personally, even if you read it and you say to yourself, this is immoral, okay. Well, if it's immoral, does that change what it is?
No.
Talk to me.
No.
Okay. So I need you to distinguish, do you want a career in political philosophy? Or do you want a career as a lawyer? Talk to me.
Career as a lawyer.
Okay, but you get it. Because we're all political philosophers. We all have philosophy, we all have political views, right? And the difficulty, I think, is that those views disable this process because you already have the answer. You already have your view, right? So if you're sitting there, and you know what, I don't want to pick on global warming, but I love it. If you have a view on global warming, is it fair to say you may have shut down the reasoning part of this?
Yes.
You already have the view. I'm not saying your view's wrong, right? But you get the thing you feel most passionately about, oftentimes is the thing you do the least reasoning on. Because you're too angry to look at the other side. You're just too angry. right? So it's very much a psychology. Can you look at a law? Can you read a law as it was written, as the writer intended it to be interpreted? That's perfectly all right. You're here. You know, and so there's, to the degree that requires a personality change, you need to make that change because you want to be lawyers, right? So you have to read the way we read, you have to write the way we write, and you have to think the way we're taught to think, and it's not optional because you want to be lawyers. And this is it. So I start with this is the basic relationship right here. You say, well, every argument involves just two things. There are only two things there. There's reasoning, and there's a conclusion. There's nothing else. So each one of these 25 arguments you read. You're either reading the writer's reasoning or the writer's conclusion. Now here's the deal. It's so, again, ISIS is so basic. If I give you, and reasoning is just evidence. So you can gather more or less evidence depending on how thorough you are. Yes? So if I were to, no, I'm not going to, but if I were to ask those of you who are going to tell me that global warming is both man-made and irreversible, if that's what you're going to tell me, isn't that your conclusion? Talk to me.
Yes.
But I don't care about your conclusion. I care about this part. You with me? And if this part is robust, wouldn't you have established that it's man-made and that is irreversible? Talk to me.
Yeah.
By your reasoning, correct? Not by your telling me that statement. Statement means nothing to me. That's your conclusion. Couldn't your conclusion be an opinion?
Yes.
And an opinion doesn't require any evidence. Your opinion, God bless you, have all you want. But when you claim something as a conclusion, you still want to be lawyers, right? Because it gets uncomfortable, right? Because you're not being political philosophers, so you can't say to people that's immoral. But you could say it. But now maybe we should get PhDs and be political philosophers. But the art of lawyering is the art of reading written words, not passing judgment on those written words. Okay. So to maintain a position like something is irreversible, right? Don't you think that takes kind of a lot of evidence?
Yes.
Because isn't it actually speculative? To say it's irreversible, don't you now have to prove that there is nothing that could ever be done to alter that course? Yes?
Yeah.
So could it be the case that it's irreversible? Could it be the case that this thing is irreversible?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Am I saying it is or it isn't? No, absolutely not. But I'm saying this is that change where you're, I think many of you are in worlds where almost everybody agrees on everything. Well, and you know, even like in New York, we're in New York, right? So, you know, hello. But if you're not part of the dominant political community in New York, well, then you belong to a sect, right? You're a little sect. But everybody within your sect basically agrees with you. That's why you're a member of that sect. None of that's good. Because you're not doing this. So this is seminal. It's absolutely seminal. The most basic principle is, if I want to make a statement, the conclusion I draw can only be as broad as the evidence I've offered. Does that make sense? The conclusion you draw is tethered to the evidence you draw, right? So if I draw evidence about Bay Ridge, a lot of evidence, I'll give you a lot of evidence about Bay Ridge, and my conclusion has to do with the borough of Brooklyn, do you get a sense that the conclusion is not adequately supported by the evidence I've provided? Talk to me. That's all there is to this. But when you want a view, right, when you want something, it is human to conveniently ignore that the only evidence you gathered had to do with one little portion of Brooklyn. Because you want the outcome, right? You want this conclusion. And so your reasoning is not thorough. So, not surprisingly on this test, do you get that that's the gravamen of a flaw? A flawed argument, right? You're going to have to solve for a flaw 8 to 10 times, right? That's the flaw. The flaw is the evidence you gave me, right? And all this is evidence. Does not support the conclusion you draw. And simply all you then do is explaining why. So, the way an argument works, and this would be an argument, when you use the word argument, this is what you're doing. So an argument, and I'll tell you, it can start with a conclusion or it can start with evidence. You get that. There are times, if you start with a conclusion, right? So you say, I want this position, I want to hold, and then you work back. When you get into this evidence, is it fair to say some evidence if you're examining a position, right, would it be fair to say that if you start with a conclusion, right, so and we do that. So if I start with my conclusion, and oftentimes I'll mistake really what I'm starting with is my opinion, right? And then I go back here and say, this person's making me actually offer support for it. And then you go look for support. When you examine the evidence, do you think you may find evidence that's both supportive and not supportive? Talk to me, yeah. You say, can you be clinical? Can you be clinical? Can you examine an issue bereft of your own personal views and be clinical? Talk to me.
Yes.
That's what this is about. It's not that, the actual content of this is not hard. But the psychology of it is, and again, take you back to my life. Do you get, I have spent time with victims of violent crime and with the family members of folks who have been murdered, right? So I don't feel, do you get a sense of rage, of anger, of sorrow, of empathy? You get all that is there, yes? Would it be fair to say I cannot allow those feelings to interfere with my ability to reason? Talk to me.
That's right.
Okay, that's the world, right? So you sit here, and hopefully you've not done that, at least much of that I've done, right? You must be clinical. And if you cannot be, this is just not the right place. And that's fine, you'll live a wonderful life, but not as a lawyer. So, they're testing this, right? This is the entire logical reasoning section, which is they're going to give you, so now, the IRAC thing is, we start with an issue. So the issue is the question. In other words, how I'm using, my language and applying to the test. Okay. So an example of that is, I'll take out exam 62. So this would be I don't have the volume. I have these things have been with me since a long time. So I'm opening up to section 2. In lot, this, I'm sorry, it's exam 62, it'll be that first exam in that book. And section 2. And I'm looking, you know, if I just look at questions 1, 2, and 3. So is everybody there? Exam 62, that'll be the first one. Section 2, that's the logical reasoning section. And every time I say the word issue, what I'm referring to, like in question number 1, the issue is which one of the following principles is best illustrated by the study above. You see that it's always located in the same place. Does everybody get question number 1? When I say the issue, I'm referring to the question presented. Talk to me.
Yes.
Because again, it all starts with definitions. When I look at question number 2, the issue is which one of the following, if true, most strengthens the argument. Yes? Talk to me. It's no good that I understand this. You with me? You have to understand it. If I look at question number 3, the issue is going to be the conclusion is most strongly supported by the reasoning in the argument if which one of the following is assumed. Does anybody have any question about where the issue is located on this test? You're okay with that, right?
Yes.
Okay. And the reason we start there, so that's the first thing you're going to read. You're not going to read, the argument is above the issue, right? So above the issue is the argument. And the argument is the law. So, if I again go back to question number 1, I'm going to start by reading the issue, and then I'm going to read the argument. But the argument is the law. So question number 1, the argument begins with in a recent study. In question number 2, the argument begins with among people who live. In question number 3, the argument begins with medication with an unpleasant taste. Talk to me, yes?
Yes.
Yes.
So from now on forever, you with me, with respect to the LSAT, you're going to read the issue first, and then you're going to apply it to the law. The law is the argument. And
Will that always be the first sentence of the passage?
I'm sorry, will what always be the first
Will the
sentence?
argument always be the first sentence of the passage?
Well, when you say passage in logical reasoning, yes, the argument will always be what appears at the very top. Okay? But understand what you're doing. Wouldn't it be, again, my goal here, right, is to prepare you for law school. And oh, by and by, your LSAT score is going to go up. Right. We begin with the issue as lawyers because that's why we picked up the law. Does that make sense? In other words, you understand, somebody could come into my life. Could somebody come into my life with a family law issue, matrimonial? Could somebody do that?
Yes.
And wouldn't that lead me to the domestic relations law, which is the law that governs, yes?
Yes.
So do you get, I picked up that book as a result of someone coming into my life with an issue, right? Later on that day, somebody could come in with a DWI, yes? Am I going to pick up the domestic relations law?
No.
No, I'm going to pick up the motor vehicle and traffic law. Why am I picking that book up? Because there's a client there. Do you see it? So in the practice of law, again, I'm not reading 1192 to pass judgment on it. You with me? I'm not reading 120, section 120 of the penal law, which deals with criminal assaults. I'm not reading that to agree or to disagree philosophically with it. Talk to me. When I go to the sentencing guidelines, you get, my job is to understand the sentencing guidelines. Talk to me. It is not my job to say these are egregious and wrong. If I am representing a client, what is my job? To read and understand the law as the law is written so that I can interpret it on behalf of my client in the light most favorable to my client. If I impose my own views, did I change the law? If I impose my own views, did I change the law?
No.
Wait, are the words in front of me? I impose my own view on the
Yes.
words in front of me. Have the words in front of me change.
No.
Talk to me.
No, no.
So, would it be fair to say that my intentions were noble? Because I meant to do good.
Yeah.
But what was the result of the outcome?
It's not gonna work.
I didn't understand the law. So you got to understand what you're coming into, right? This is not about, do you want to be, I mean, what takes greater challenge, to protest or to change the thing being protested?
Change the thing that's being
Oh,
protested.
well, in other words, what attributes does it take to get a placard in my hand saying, yes, no, whatever, right? What are the attributes needed for that, distinguished from what are the attributes needed by the person who looks at the person protesting and says, well, that's great, I'm fine with that. How about we change what you're protesting? Would you agree with me, the person who seeks to change has the greater burden? Because you can just put your placard down at the end of the day and, oh, I went out and protested. Oh, and I, in a million years, I don't mean to denigrate that. More may be required of you than that. So, but to change something implicates this process. You with me? How are you going to be successful at getting stuff changed? Aren't you going to have to come see me? Or, you know what I'm saying? You're going to have to see people. You're going to come into my world, right? Here's my world, right? And you're going to tell me whatever you tell me, and I'm going to say to you, well, give me your reasoning. Because I don't know whether what you have is an opinion or a conclusion. I don't really care, right? Give me your reason that I care about. So, you're reading the issue first, because the issue tells me what the writer wants me to do with this. Right? And again, what the this is, you're reading textually, right? So again, you're taking the issue. If you misunderstand the issue, you can't understand the law. Because you're applying the wrong issue to it. Do you see it? It's really very straightforward. So as a lawyer, this stuff is granular. You have to understand precisely what the issue is requiring you to do. Then you have to understand precisely what the law states and what can be inferred reasonably from what the law states. And if you don't infer carefully, you'll be back here in the law gave me information about Bay Ridge, right? But I was rooting for the whole borough. So my conclusion had to do with the entire borough of Brooklyn, right? Okay, maybe I was well-intentioned. What is the difference of what my intentions were? Because now my conclusion is no longer valid and I can't represent my client effectively because I've drawn a conclusion that's ineffective. So what you need to be focusing on now is the analysis, for the time being, we're going to be slash marks. You put slash marks in there. And as Rochelle had a wonderful email saying, well, but what if you can't put slash marks on the exam when they go to tablet? You probably can. I mean, I don't actually know.
That question was answered for me. So I went on Instagram and I asked one of the law school sites about this. I said, let me ask you a question. And they said, that's a great question. They said, what they're going to give is stylus, so you can write on it.
Yeah, that was,
Yeah. Mhm.
so. But the slash marks, they're like training wheels, you know. The discipline of this is all so doable if it's on your heart, and if you have the preparation gene. And if you don't have the preparation gene, you need to be a freaking genius to do this, and I'm certainly not. So, as you read, and this now is how you're going to read in regular life. If the writer is writing to see if you're reading textually, then this just means you're going to read the way I read. Right? So slash marks are what I'm referring to as you're reading textually. And that means you get to a period, you're gonna have your slash marks there. The first thing I would do in any of these arguments, if I were reading question number 1 in exam 62, the very first thing I would do is I would read the issue and I would know I'm looking for a principle. I have to understand what a principle is. Because this is an example of a principle. Do you understand? And everything you're reading are examples, right? So if the issue is to identify a principle, would it be fair to say you're dead if you don't understand conceptually what a principle is? Talk to me.
Yes.
So this is exactly the way law school works. This is the method of reasoning in law school is to proceed by example. That's how you're going to learn in law school. You learn by example. So up here, right, the person's going to come in contracts in your first year, and they're trying to get you to understand, like, when is something an offer? Because not everything's an offer. If I say to you, if I stay up here now and I say, hey, I'll take $30 for my CRV in the parking lot, and then somebody said, all right, your deal. Was that an offer? And I'm not asking you, but you get, that's how law school's going to proceed, right? The person up here understands conceptually what constitutes an offer, right? What constitutes acceptance and consideration. And the way that's communicated to you is example after example after example. So here's example A, that was an offer. And here's example B, that wasn't an offer. You get a lot of examples, yes? And so examples are your friends. If you don't understand what a principle is, you're dead, with respect to question number 1. But what you're looking at is an example of a principle. So you get that every time, and on your test you'll have to identify principles probably 5 or 6 times. You're going to get all of them wrong if you don't understand what a principle is. Talk to me.
Yes.
You know, if you go to the one beneath that, go to question number 2, say, well, what are they looking for? So clearly one of the things in terms of conceptually, right? Don't you get, once you understand what a principle is, then when you see an example of it, you recognize it. Question number 2 says, which one of the following most strengthens the argument? Okay, so you're going to be required to strengthen or weaken an argument 10 to 12 times on the test. That's not counting reading comprehension. What if you don't know how to strengthen or weaken an argument? What if you don't know the actual technique we use to strengthen or weaken an argument? You get that intuitively everybody in this room, just because God sent you down that way, everyone in this room intuitively can strengthen or weaken an argument. But does that mean you do it as effectively as somebody who's been trained to do it? Does that mean you weaken an argument as effectively as the writer who wrote the argument? No. No. So no matter what issue I pick, it's going to be on your test, right? Well, there are a couple exceptions, not many. And the goal here is to understand this. And once you understand this, assumptions. I think I'll give you question number 3. The conclusion is most strongly supported by the reasoning in the argument. So think about what those words mean. The conclusion is most strongly supported by the reasoning. If which one of the following is assumed? Yeah, if which one of the following is assumed. Slow down. This is most strongly supported by this if what is assumed. Isn't that kind of like a mouthful? Talk to me.
Yes.
So will you go slow? Will you be patient? Will you basically, it's basically learning how to learn, right? It's just a different way of learning. wouldn't it be swell if you really, really, honest to God, understood what an assumption was? Wouldn't that be swell? Yeah, but I'm saying, this is what they're doing, George. In other words, if you don't understand, you know, so I write the word up on the board. Okay. How does that help you, other than you have the word written up on the board, right? So if the final exam were, well, Peter's calling this an argument, right? And if your final exam was, what are the components of an argument? Well, then you could write these words down and you get an A. That's not the examples. So, the way we proceed is, let's start here with, you need to recognize the difference between the facts in an argument and the conclusion of the argument. You with me? As you put these slash marks in, right? One of the things you're looking for is what's to the left of that slash mark? Is that evidence that's to the left? Is that the conclusion that's to the left? But you need to be able to distinguish. So you're not just reading the words, right? You're reading the role in the argument that the words play. Now, who here in college has been required to identify the role in the argument of certain words? That been on anybody's final? Sure? You have?
Major.
I'm sorry?
English major.
Well, in English major, you would be required for sure to be able to describe an adjective from an adverb. That's separate from, have you been required to identify in an argument that the role of a sentence is that it's a subordinate conclusion? No. Yes. Oh.
I have had to do that.
Well, that's good. Well, then you're going to be at an advantage. You've actually been required to say the role in the sentence is a subordinate conclusion, inconsistent with the argument's main conclusion, something like that.
I mean, well, not those words, because the Talmud is in Aramaic, but same effect.
Yeah, cool. That's going to help you a lot on this test. Because what you're getting tested on here, what they're relying on in the test is the vast, vast majority of test takers have not done this. And what they're doing here, and one of the things in terms of the psychometric part of this, again, you get as a lawyer, you have to learn stuff you don't presently know. That if you think about somebody who goes into general practice, right? Law school does not prepare you for general practice. Law school does not prepare you. Law school prepares you to think like a lawyer, and it gives you some content. But if you open up a general practice, you get somebody may come in one day and want to do a closing. Would it be fair to say you now have to learn the law with respect to closings?
Yes.
Somebody the next day may come in with the DWI. You now have, not only do you have to learn the motor vehicle and traffic law, but if that case goes to trial, don't you now have to learn evidence? Yes, talk to me.
Yes.
Don't you have to learn procedure? Talk to me.
Yes.
But how do you get that action into court? What are the preliminary motions? Do you want to learn? You know, and that really is, to me, and I couldn't have answered that question when I was young. Well, maybe I could have, but it's a lot clearer to me now that I love to learn, and I'm not all that smart. I just love learning. But but being a lawyer, one of this test is doing is, for the vast majority of test takers, they have not been, analytical reasoning is foreign to most everyone. And one of the strategies that's out there is you try to take something that's purposely unfamiliar, and the LSAT is purposely unfamiliar, because your first year of law school will be almost entirely unfamiliar. So have you met people who don't adapt well? That, like, maybe they're very, very good at A, B, and C, but really, you get outside the comfort zone and they're not going to perform all that well. Have you met people who, they're not all that gifted when they get outside the comfort zone? And that type of person is more likely to struggle in law school. So the LSAT is all over this. And I mentioned this thing. Because what I'm talking about now here, working within this universe, the writer can require the reader to tell the writer what the method of reasoning was that was used. And you will be required to do that on your test. This issue will arise typically 2 to 5 times. And what I'm saying to you is, as you get used to this, as you get used to the slash marks and reading textually and saying it's not just the words, but I'm saying I want the role in the argument. In other words, could a piece of evidence be supportive of the argument's main conclusion? Talk to me.
Yes.
But you're going to be tested on that. When's the last time you've read that way? Where not only are you reading the words, right, but you're saying, and the role in the argument is. And you may not know the role in the argument until you've completed the entire argument, because it may change or develop. Could it be the case, however, that, and again, whether they say premise or they say evidence or they say fact, none of that matters. But could you put a slash mark, read to, look to the left and say the role in that argument is that, one, it's a piece of evidence, meaning it's not the conclusion, right? And its role was to support the argument's main conclusion. Could that be the case? But wouldn't that require you to identify both where the evidence was and where the conclusion was? Talk to me.
Yes.
Well, but if you're reading and not reading that way, you're not going to know. Unless you just intuitively know, which some people do. They just intuitively get this. Not a ton of them. Okay, so, but then there's evidence that could be rebutted further down in the argument, right? There's evidence that could be presented in an argument that's harmful to the argument's conclusion, yes? Okay, they're testing you on that. Is there going to be somewhere in there, if they use the word argument, then there's got to be a conclusion there. There's no escaping it, because you can't have an argument without a conclusion. Could they direct you to a sentence you've read, require you to could there be a sentence they have there, and the issue is identify the role in the argument of the sentence? It will be there, I promise you. Okay. But how cool would it be if you knew the role in the argument of the sentence by the time you stopped reading? In other words, you didn't need the answer. You could have written the answer choice. How cool would that be? Okay, well, it's in your hands, my friends. Because that's what they're going to do. They're going to say the role in the argument question is saying, here, we're going to give you one sentence, right? Now tell me, when the author wrote that, do you get that when the author wrote a sentence, that sentence would fit in the fabric of the entire argument? Yes? So the author had a purpose for that sentence, not just the words, right? But the author had a purpose for that sentence. But you're going to be required to tell what that purpose was, which has to be done by inference. So you can have a piece of evidence that supports a conclusion, a piece of evidence that contradicts or weakens a conclusion. You can have a subordinate conclusion, which is supportive or not supportive of an argument's main conclusion. You can have a main conclusion. They don't have a lot to go on. And unless they're going to make it a Yale question, they're going to have something silly, like it's the argument's main conclusion. And you're saying that can't be. Well, it is. It's not that complicated. You're overthinking it. So, do you get by doing this, you're preparing yourself for role in the argument? Talk to me.
Yes.
With respect to method of reasoning, I think lawyers have a heavy reliance on analogies do you get, if you don't understand what an analogy is, you can't identify one. In other words, you yourself may actually use an analogy, but not understand what an analogy is. You're just doing it, right? But if I proceed by analogy, and I often do, if I proceed by analogy, would it be fair to say that my method of reasoning is to proceed by analogy? Talk to me. Okay, so I'm up here, right? Right? The issue is method of reasoning, right? And I'm up here, so okay, all right, now I'm reading the argument, right? But now I'm putting my slash marks in. But do you understand that now I'm reading the argument not for the role in the argument of a sentence, but for the technique that's used, the method of reasoning, I could say the technique as well, right? And so if I see the argument starts off at, say it's going to be maybe a level 1 or a level 2. So it's designed for 60 or 65% of people to get it right. That's going to be, I think, about 40% of the test. So you get, when you see it, you're almost certainly correct, because it wasn't designed to be hidden. Do you talk to me? It's such a tactical and strategic test, and law is so tactical and so strategic. Again, if you want to be a philosopher, that's fine. But the practice of law is not the same. You know, that's when you get a PhD, and that's fine. But this is not that. So if I'm going to give you as a writer a level 1, and I will, and I want to put it in the form of method of reasoning, or argumentative technique, which is the same thing. If you start out reading about dinosaurs and establishing their age, so you're putting your slash mark and you're reading about dinosaurs and establishing their age, and then you get further down in the argument and you're reading about fish and establishing their age, would it be fair to say that the writer is analogizing fish to dinosaurs? Talk to me. Well, then, if that's the case, the argumentative technique, the method of reasoning, is the person is proceeding by analogy. So if answer choice A is the author is proceeding by analogy, what's the answer? A. And you need to pull the trigger. I'm not, again, you got to prepare first, right? But again, this psychometric thing. How about this? In law, everything's done with a standard. How about I give you a standard, and then you decide if it works for you, right? But in terms of my work, right? If somebody gives me a civil case, then I have to, the conclusion I do, right, has to be proven by preponderance of the evidence. Preponderance just means 50.1%. It's more likely than not, that's all. So OJ, on the civil case, is guilty because the preponderance of the evidence, it was more likely than not he committed the crime. And so he was held civilly liable. He was not held criminally liable. Because the criminal stuff, I have to show everybody in this room is beyond a reasonable doubt. Do you get it's harder to show something is beyond a reasonable doubt than it is to show that it's more likely than not? Talk to me.
Yes.
And you get, as a result, this now affects the way I do this, right? That if I get to a civil case and I feel like I'm well into the 70 percentile thing in terms of likelihood, right? I'm just looking at what you guys are going to say, and I'd say, well, if I weren't me, if I were you, and I saw these facts, if I saw this, and I saw this conclusion, then I'd say, that's 70% likely. Well, if I'm in a civil case, I'm done. I don't need to do any more work. But if I'm in a criminal case, that's not going to get me a conviction. And that's when you decide to stop as a lawyer. You with me? That's when you're saying, I have other cases, I have other obligations, I have a family, I've got a life. At some point you stop and you say, I'm done. Yes, talk to me.
Yes.
Okay. So how about on the LSAT, you have a standard? How about you start thinking like lawyers now? Could you do that? Could you start thinking like lawyers now? it's, you know. Okay. Here's the standard, because there are two words that you're gonna get. When it is clear and convincing, and those are the two words, when you look at an answer choice, right, and it's clear and convincing, then it is the answer choice. Now you have to figure out what those two words mean, like when is something clear and convincing to you? But if answer choice A is clear and convincing, I'm saying at least experiment with this, right? We're gonna get guidance from the issue as well. Some issues there can only be one answer choice. Other issues there can be multiple answer choices. But your standard from now on is when the evidence is clear and convincing, I'm moving forward on my case. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Does that sound like the psychology of a lawyer? Does that sound like the way a lawyer would think?
Yes.
Okay, and because what the test measures is how much you think like a lawyer. And I'm telling you, God is my witness, it's no big deal. I mean, if you can do that, if you can just stop being a jerk, which is actually very hard for me. But, okay. So arguments proceed here. They proceed by, I gather evidence. Now, again, in the real world, could I present something as a fact that turned out not to be a fact? Could I rely on a statement that I thought was true or I thought was accurate that ended up not being true or not being accurate? Talk to me.
Yes.
In real life, yeah.
Yes.
Well, George, well, if it happened all the time, I'd be doing something else. but yes.
For non-lawyers, anyway.
Well, for lawyers too. But I want you to stop and think about that, because in the real world, you may call something a fact. That's not a fact. You know, I mean, if I go to the global warming, that's a fact. Oh, but we need a conversation. I mean, if it's a fact, you'll have some work to do for me. It may be a fact, but it needs to be established that it's a fact. So, when we're working here, in the real world, we need to prove a fact, right? So if I put a witness on the stand, and if I have a police officer come in, the police officer says, yeah, no, I made the arrest, that's the guy. I saw that person. I made the arrest a couple of days later, you know, but I saw that person. I now have the option of putting that witness on the stand or not putting that witness on the stand? Yes? Could that person be mistaken? Could the person believe they saw something that in fact they didn't see? Is that possible?
Yes.
Okay. And so in the real world, I'm in the back room saying, well, hold on. Let's talk about the lighting conditions. Let's talk about your opportunity to observe. Let's talk about what, if any, stress you were under at the time. Let's talk about what was the distance from which you made these observations. Let's talk about, had you ever seen this person before? Let's talk about what's your eyesight. There are a lot of questions I have. Talk to me.
Yeah, that's your strategy.
That's what it is to be a lawyer. If that person's testimony has to do with conviction, I really, really, really want, because the person is going to go back out in the street and harm. You with me? And I absolutely know that. No, I can't absolutely know anything, right? But you get in that job, you feel. You know, I mean, I could go on, right? You motivation's on an issue, but you get those feelings could interfere with this analysis.
Yes.
Where I want that conviction. So I want what that officer said to be true. And as a result, it interferes with my analysis. You get that's not where you want me. And that's what I'm saying, when you guys, that's where you need to get to. You need to get away from, well, everybody says. Okay, that's nice. I don't care what they say. Maybe it's an opinion. How do they read? Difference here on the LSAT is the facts that appear in the argument cannot be challenged. And that's analogous to, again, this thing here, the argument is the law, which is kind of what I opened on, right? That you can read a law. Again, I have no position on this because I can't really have a position on something where I haven't familiarized myself with the law. Are you with me? Does that mean I don't root for an outcome? No, I root for an outcome. But I can't take a position because I haven't read the law. When the courts deal with the issue of whether or not the president's declaration of an emergency, whether that is an adequate basis for building the wall, do you get that there is a declaration, there is law that governs this? Talk to me.
Yes.
And if the law that governs this, if you read the law that governs this, right? The law that governs this, as it was written, aren't you bound by that law?
Yes.
Talk to me.
Yes, yes.
But if you're rooting for one side, and you're passionately rooting for one side, if that's the case, doesn't it make it more challenging to read the law?
Yes.
But if you misread the law because you read your own views into it, you're going to lose. So can you do that? And here it is on logical reasoning on the LSAT. As I said last week, if the first sentence you read is that every planet you'll never see is purple, what is now a fact? Every planet you'll never see is purple. Do you get it? So you can't come in, because so many times, like, folks will come in and they have specialties. So Lori, and hopefully at some point Lori will come in and speak, but Lori has a science background, and when Lori was in here, right, she was reading some Ridicon passage, and she was just outraged. That's not right, that's not right, you know? And it's like, well, Lori, is it in the passage? Yes. And is the passage the law? Yes. Then what is it? Well, it's the law. So it's so here, the facts are established, the evidence cannot be challenged, and you can rely on it. You go from the conclusion, when you're done with now you've read the argument, and you go to the conclusion, and again, you just need to be careful. There are only two avenues here. There are things that could be true and things that must be true. Does that seem about right? Wouldn't it also follow that anything that could be true could also be false? So really there are three statements. You could have, there are things that could be true, which also means could be false. You could have things that must be true, and you could have things that must be false. Is that pretty much about it?
Yes.
And don't you think if your conclusion is that something must be, doesn't that require more evidence?
Yes.
Well, it may not require more, I mean, it seems to be generally it would, right? But doesn't it require more persuasive evidence?
Yes.
Isn't your standard higher?
Yes.
You get it? So when you're reading the LSAT, if a conclusion is a categorical statement, you ever think about the word is? I use the word is, and then I kind of like try to weave the word is, to whether it's a categorical, whether that's introducing a categorical statement. If I say, Peter is of Irish ancestry, which to the best of my knowledge I am, but if I say Peter is of Irish ancestry, didn't I just leave myself no wiggle room? Did I say Peter may be of Irish ancestry? Did I say Peter almost certainly is of Irish ancestry? So you get the word is itself is categorical. And therefore the evidence, for me to say that, right, the evidence I must give you would be 100%, which actually is not possible. So inference that's all I can do. I can infer, based on the fact that I do recall my dad speaking with Baroque, based on the fact that I have his birth certificate, which is from Sligo, based on the fact that I myself have gone to Ireland and met people who claim to be his siblings, claim to be my cousins. Would it be fair to say I can make a pretty persuasive case that I'm of Irish ancestry? Yes. But have I proven it beyond any doubt? And that's what this is about, is being more careful with language. I can't prove anything beyond any doubt. And so, when something could be true, if something was 99% likely, is it also something that could be true?
Yes.
If something is 99% likely, is it ever something that must be true?
No.
And that's what this is about. Can you slow down and be more careful with language and be more aware of language? And it's not going to happen overnight, but it's going to happen. Can you do it? Well, then you could be a lawyer. So we go from here to here, either by inference, which just means the matter could be true, or by deduction, which means it must be true. And we're going to eventually link that up with the issue you're dealing with. In other words, the issues on your test sheet, you have about 14 issues, to weaken an argument, to strengthen an argument, to identify an assumption or a flaw. The issue itself dictates whether or not you're looking for a conclusion, whether the proof must be inferential or deductive. Meaning, you're looking, so you're going to be, when the issue appears, which of the following must be true, is it fair to say the answer choice has to be 100%? Talk to me. Okay, and that's going to be on your test. There are issues that are more obscure. There are issues like the conclusion is properly drawn if which of the following is assumed. Well, and we'll get into that, right? But again, that is a sufficient assumption. And every sufficient assumption requires an answer choice that must be true, not could be true, must be true. And remember, could be 99%, so they can look an awful lot like something that must be true. So this just takes time. You need to know the issue. You need to know, with respect to each and every issue, can you responsibly pull the trigger, right? Which means some issues can only have one answer choice, and it never, ever, ever, ever changes. There are other issues that will always have the possibility of multiple answer choices. So doesn't it make sense for you to be aware of that? You get this takes time. So again, looking at this, and you get this connection that the more persuasive your reasoning, right? I don't care about your conclusion. The nature of this business, right, is that you become persuasive. That I don't go into the jury room. Isn't it fair to say that if you were my jury, you would have to draw the conclusion as to the defendant's guilt or absence of guilt? Or wouldn't you have to make that decision? Wouldn't you be the decision maker?
Yes.
Okay. And isn't it my job to give you reasoning from which you can be comfortable is maybe the wrong word, but isn't it my job to give you sufficient evidence, right, that you say, I'm not finding this person guilty because I don't like the person. I'm not finding this person guilty on socioeconomic grounds or any other ground. I'm finding this person guilty because the evidence requires it. That's our job. And it's not just being a DA. That's the job of every attorney everywhere, no matter what practice they're in, is here. So start thinking this way. Stop with the broad, overreaching, everybody agrees stuff. And say, well, I don't care that because everybody can be wrong. And everybody actually doesn't agree. You're just hanging out with everybody who agrees. And come into this community where questioning is an honorable thing, where questioning is embraced, where I want to understand your position. If your position is correct, I so want to understand it. I so want to understand it. I don't want to keep making a fool of myself. But for me to understand it, you have to articulate it. And that's the depth. So just get good at this and you'll have just a wonderful life. Okay, so I've covered this stuff, right? Got all of this, right? That's assumptions. Every argument on the planet is